Iraqis recently celebrated the one-year anniversary of the liberation of Mosul. Tens of thousands of displaced Christians have returned to their cities and villages in the Nineveh Plain, but many refuse to return to Mosul. 30,000 Christians lived in Iraq's second largest city before the Islamic State moved in, and today only about 100 or so have returned. Investigative journalist author Ken Timmerman understands all too well what many Iraqi Christians are up against. He's written a new book. It's called ISIS Begins. It's a novel about the Iraq War. It includes stories about suffering Christians. Ken, thanks so much for joining us. So why a novel this time? We're so used to your investigative reporting of events.
Well, thank you, Gary. Thanks for having me on. Look, the tragedy that these Christians are undergoing is remarkable. We only get it through the filter of the media. We don't really see and feel and understand. You have to go on the ground to understand what these people have gone through. I've done that many, many times, both on mission trips and reporting trips. And so I thought it was important to give you that ground truth, to give readers a ground truth so they could get a better understanding of what it means to be a persecuted Christian, to be chased by jihadi Muslim groups.
Yeah, it's one of the worst tragedies in the world today. So please share one of the most compelling stories from your book, Ken. I'm sure it's based on fact.
Well, the central character is an Iraqi Christian interpreter. He's working for U.S. Special Forces in Iraq, and he's chased by a jihadi cell leader, comes back. He tries to take his family to Jordan to get U.S. asylum, as the U.S. government had promised, but of course they prefer to bring Muslims into the United States and not Christians. This is a sad fact of the State Department bureaucracy. So he goes back to Iraq and winds up on a mission trip with a group of U.S. pastors and others, and they are attacked while they're handing out aid in the Nineveh Plain by a jihadi terrorist dressed as a woman, and the central character's brother, who's a guard there, gets killed in that attack trying to defend the people in a tent receiving aid because they're destitute.
And Ken, this really isn't fiction. I mean, these are things that have happened in the past and are continuing to happen there.
They're happening all the time. I've interviewed so many people on the ground in Mosul, in the Nineveh Plain, in Al-Qush, where the events at the end of my novel take place. There's a jihadi attack on this monastery up in the hills there. It's really quite extraordinary. And at the time, I have U.S. Special Forces kind of coming to the rescue. The air cavalry comes in, and there's a big battle at the end. But it would have been great if it had happened that way on the ground. It did not. The Christians were never rescued. They had to flee, and they fled for their lives. And many of them, as we know, they just didn't make it.
And Ken, I was in Al-Qush as many Christians came into that city. It's a Christian city. They look for protection. We handed out relief there. So I know what you're talking about. What can you tell us about the current situation, though, on the ground for Iraqi Christians? I think many Americans mistakenly think that everything's fine now that ISIS has been defeated, but that isn't the case. Tell us what you've learned.
No, it's not the case, and people are afraid, and it's understandable that they're afraid, but they're afraid because the networks are still there underground. Especially, you mentioned Mosul in your intro, and you're absolutely right. In the Nineveh Plain, they have slightly different problems. They don't have security. They've been trying to have an Assyrian Christian police force there for many, many years, and the Kurds have been blocking it, unfortunately. That's what they need. They need security on the ground. But in Mosul, they really need to root out these jihadi groups that are underground, that are still there. That's a real underlying problem. People are just afraid. They're afraid they will again be targeted.
Well, I know, because, you know, I've talked to people as well in Iraq who've told me, why should I go back to the same town that I lived in where my neighbors turned against me? It'll just happen again. And I know that you warned everyone about the consequences of the American pullout from Iraq and the rise of groups like ISIS. And how likely is it that another ISIS-like terrorist group will rise up and cause more bloodshed?
Well, if we leave Iraq, they will, and because that's where ISIS began, hence my title, ISIS Begins. When President Obama announced the date certain of the U.S. withdrawal, the jihadi groups that had been defeated, utterly defeated during the surge under President Bush, they just decided to bide their time. They knew when they could come back out. Onto the main streets, if you wish, and they combined together with the stay-behind networks of Saddam Hussein. Those networks are still there, and the combination of al-Qaeda, if you wish, and those stay-behind Ba'athist networks, that's what gave us ISIS, and that symbiosis, those two groups are still there on the ground.
Well, Ken, how then can our viewers make a difference in the lives of Iraqi Christians at this time? What would you suggest we do?
Well, there are a number of aid groups who are distributing aid. You've certainly been involved with some of them. Frank Gaffney at the Center for Security Policy has put together a coalition called SaveThePersecutedChristians.org. I've also worked with Christian Solidarity International, a tremendous group. And their partner on the ground is called the Hammurabi Human Rights Organization, HHRO.org. They are run by absolutely amazing people, Iraqi Christians themselves. They're on the ground in the Nineveh Plain. They do wonderful work. But any of those groups are really worthy of our viewers' support.
Okay, the novel is ISIS Begins. Ken Timmerman, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.